progress for black actors in Hollywood is not so happy and, sorry Annie, not so sunny. In fact, it became news as the Oscars were on air this week that 90% of the 5,000 members of the Academy of Motion Pictures are white. Films with black stars, as you already know this, often have to be independently financed. Black actors and actors of color across the board often struggle for, forget leading roles, any roles at all. And it's this contradiction, the sense of one step forward, two steps back, that leads us to examine what really is happening with black progress and where the underlying challenges are to moving ahead. So our goal was to tell a more complete story, to launch conversations like the one we're having today. We told the story of a black family whose white patriarch was a slaveholder, and how that had the potential to make things a little complicated when the family reunion started to include the white relatives. Take a look.
I put an ad in the Genealogical Helper, and a couple of months later I got a letter from this wonderful lady.
I said, "Dear Mrs. Hicks," and I went on to tell her that I was the great-great-granddaughter of William Harrison Hale Rand, and boy, did she really write me back.
What'd she write?
And she said, "Now we are cousins, and you either call me Martha or Cousin Martha." She won me over right there.
So there's a white branch of the Rands,
Right.
which you're part of,
Right,
and the black branch of the Rands.
right, right.
In a lot of ways, the story of the Rands is the story of American families.
With the grand jury, what the grand jury does is it is comprised of citizens. It usually it makes a majority. The majority decides whether to indict or not. And it's basically, you have to have more evidence than not that the person actually has committed the act, committed the crime.
But listen, if the federal government and the state government both deem that George Zimmerman did not break the law in killing Trayvon Martin, then that tells me we need to change the law. Because that did not happen.
And that makes a very different question, right? So whether the law has changed or not, that's a very different question. I can tell you what the law is and what the goals of the law are designed to do. And the goals of the law really are designed for a police officer. You want him or her to make snap judgments and make hard decisions, and you don't want him or her to be second guessed. Now, the question is when race gets interwoven into that, it becomes much more complex.
I want to ask a question. What has changed, let's say, over the last 20 years, when you were an activist back then and an activist now? What do you see as having changed? Hold on, I don't hear you, because I see your lips moving, but I do not hear a word you're saying.
Just ask the professor or something. You know, in your profession, it is said that you can indict a handful. I have heard that anybody can be indicted. So isn't that you can indict a handful in less than 7? Kill the black man?
No, that's not the issue. The issue here is that, there's a grand jury process. The grand jury decides these kinds of questions. It's evidence that his role, her role, has certain protections because of the nature of what a police officer does in terms of protecting the public. So the police officer, in that he can use excessive, she can use excessive force if in fact there is a person who he thinks is committing a crime is trying to flee, if he feels that the person is committing a crime, or if he feels that his life or the life of others is threatened. And that's the
Which
challenge.
is kind of a large loophole, right? All you have to do is say, I felt my life was in danger.
So 6 policemen on top of 1 black man and whose life was in danger. I know we don't want to be arguing these cases, but, it just strikes me that as we talk about so many of these things, that we've got to look back at the way that race has shaped this, and the fact that oftentimes the prosecutors are complicit. They do not intend, I think in the Ferguson case, the prosecutor didn't intend to make an argument about the death of
Ferguson, Missouri.
So one thing I just want to say is that, so in a case like Mike Brown's shooting, what is argued is that you don't know what happened. It was an officer. He felt his life was in danger, and so he's given certain protections under the law. If only there was a videotape. So then you have Eric Garner, and there was a videotape. And then there's neither an officer or had any authority to pursue somebody or kill them. And so the problem is that in combination, and I think that's just why you've seen what happened in Ferguson, what you've seen happen in August and the last part of last year across the country, is that this frustration is building because the only common thing in all these cases is that it seems like young African Americans don't have the same protections as others. And I think that is a real crisis that we're facing. When a large group of citizens feel that they don't have equal protection of the law, it leads to things like we saw in Ferguson. You know, when we saw those fires in November, that was really a very low point for our community. It showed so many people feeling that they could only be heard and could only get the results if they went outside of the system and somehow engaged in violence or destruction. And that's just a bad place for us to be as a country. We're trying to rebuild, to answer your question. We formed a nonprofit organization called ELSTL to try to rebuild and help bridge the community, but in many ways some things are worse than ever. There are really bad existing frictions that currently exist, and what feeds that is that people have not seen change. Even after all we've seen, they have not seen any change.
So then that's kind of the $64,000 question. Should I try Chuck one last time? Yes. Okay, Chuck.
But when does it actually come out into society and end up being an asset? When does it supplement the good side? It's like the bad story is always said, especially from a black entertainer, and especially from somebody in rap music. So news is very important, you know, that it has a balanced perspective. But we've seen that go backwards. So, you know, I think the artists and their best, you know, have to try to tell our own stories. Maybe social media helps. It's not like having free TV or free, which isn't free anymore, but free radio on the airwaves. And look at Ferguson, you know, Talib Kweli, Killer Mike, Rosa Clemente, you know, people went out there and really did a fantastic job. But were they actually broadcast? I mean, there were almost like 50 to 60 songs that were made out of the situation in Ferguson alone. There was about 50 songs that were made on Katrina, 50 songs were made on Haiti. But, you know, if you have big businesses, the only concern is projecting the stereotypes for their bottom line to send some executive off to some posh situation, then you're going to have stereotypes swell up, and you're going to have the realities swell down, and then you're going to have people that are going to be faced with the realities of believing these stereotypes as being pumped, actually suffer the consequences when it comes down to knowing law, knowing the community, the do's and the don'ts. I'd like to also add this, since I'm on the mic. This is the thing when I was growing up.
Really hard to get a mic back.
The law was kind of known by the community, but what was interpreted down to you was your way to deal with the law, and as you were looked upon. As time goes on, we always have to have this education in that context, where the old heads have to be able to inform the younger people, this is what you're in the middle of, and until it's clearly dissipated, you're going to have to know these principles.
People are not convinced that they're being treated fairly under the law. In the context of communities where there has not been economic investment, and there's been a lot of devastation, and they feel that they're, you know, struggling and in poverty. How do you say, realistically, like, here's what we need to do to have a thoughtful conversation that moves the ball forward? Why don't you start with
Well, I think we're having a thoughtful conversation here, and I'm really thankful that you're here. And I think an academic institution like ours does that. We've had a program on CLE that looked at...
It's Chuck. Keep going.
We had a CLE that looked at grand juries and policing and civil rights. We brought the community together to discuss these issues. We have a program, and there's actually some...
All right, we're happy too. Dean, why don't you finish? Chuck, stand by. I think we can hear you now. Go ahead, sir.
Well, several other things. We have a program that's designed to link middle school kids with law school students who would be mentored. And actually, some of the students are here tonight, is my understanding. Can you shout out to you? But it's a way to make sure that... It's a way to make sure that kids, you know, we may have issues there's early interaction with the juvenile justice system, that's more likely to lead to sort of crime and incarceration and other things. So it's great for our law school and our law school students to do that. We've also established a pipeline program for college students who may be interested in going to law school to enhance and increase the diversity of the profession. Those will be from low income and underrepresented backgrounds and first generation backgrounds. So there's a lot of things that we can do to move the ball forward. And in terms of the law, I think these kinds of conversations are helpful to have a discussion of the way the law can be reformed, the law can be changed. There's a lot of things on the table now, a lot of discussions. Some of them have been, video cameras. UC has actually adopted video cameras. There's also opportunities for maybe change of the grand jury process. There's been a number of proposals to actually take it away from the grand jury, the issues that you had talked about, so that you would actually have maybe the Attorney General, a special prosecutor appointed in these kinds of cases. The good thing about the law, and the beauty of the law, is that it adapts and it changes to all the things that have happened in society. It is, as Dr. King had said, the moral arc of the universe is long but advanced towards justice. The law, the beauty of the law, is that it does change. We've seen incredible amounts of change in our society over the past 50, 100 years. And I think that this is just a part of the process of moving forward.
So it's disappointing, and I think it's also a missed opportunity. I think one of the crises that we find ourselves in is trying to restore people's faith in the system. And there are so many people right now who feel that the system does not value their lives equally, and I think that's bad for all of us.
Many people were relying on the DOJ, which I think, again, as the alderman mentioned, people thought in the Mike Brown case what happened, and once again hasn't. Is this laws need to be changed, or is it sort of a different philosophy, or people need to readjust their thinking about their expectations?
Well, I think part of it is we have to understand what the law provides. And basically for civil rights action, you have to show that there's some sort of specific intent to deprive somebody of their rights. And that's sort of the challenge of showing that in this particular case. We saw in the Rodney King case many years ago that you had a videotape that sort of showed what the police were doing to him. And that was a successful case. The challenge with a lot of these cases is that there's no video, and that all we have is the testimony or the one person versus the other. And that's sort of the challenge, because when you have to show intent, you have to show that the actor actually decided that that's what he wanted to do, that he specifically went out of his way to deprive that person of his life or liberty.
But Brother Professor, in the Trayvon Martin case, there was a telephone call. I'm going to defer to you. You're the legal expert. Yes. I just do the economy. However, I also read the news. Trayvon Martin Jordan Zimmerman was on the telephone, and they told him to stop. They told him not to follow the young man. They said stop. And he chose to continue, and he chose to use his weapon. And so while we don't have a videotape, we certainly have the audio of someone being told, don't go there. And this man obviously, never mind.